Hello, I'm filming this as a video to go along with the lecture on how to approach the visual arts. So I'm unable to get it to work in sync with Keynote, which is my Mac's version of PowerPoint, and I can't seem to figure out how to do it in Blackboard or on YouTube. So I'm filming the YouTube clip, and I have it open here on my laptop, so I'm going to ask you to open up the PowerPoint yourself. While you play my video, you don't have to be watching me if you don't want to, and we can go through the PowerPoint together. So the very first slide is Grant Wood's American Gothic. The idea of this little lecture is to talk a little bit about how it is that we look at visual art. What are some of the ways and some of the things that we can consider when we're looking at how visual art works, the languages that it speaks. So again, the first slide is of Grant Wood, American Gothic. The next slide is called how to approach the visual arts. There are certain elements to the visual arts. These are some of the pieces of sort of the building blocks, the bits of the artists use in order to make meaning. The medium, in this case, is not referred to a psychic or to a gypsy who can tell your fortune, but rather the medium is what's the form, what structure does it take? Is it a painting? Is it a sculpture? Is the painting in oil? Is the painting in acrylic? Is the sculpture in bronze, or is it in brass? Is it mixed media? Is it pencil and ink on canvas? Is it pen and ink on paper? What is it? So that's what we refer to as the medium. The line is, of course, the line, or the line of the work as it looks visually on the page, the shapes that it makes, the colors that are chosen, if there's a contrast between light and dark, what are the spaces that are being used, both the spaces of the objects themselves or the figures themselves, and then what we call the negative space or the space between those figures. And then also we think about what is the scale and the size of the piece. So if you're looking at these pieces of design, moving on to the next slide, you'll also talk about the content and the organization. So what is if it's a painting, what is the painting of? What is the figure? How do those figures fit together on the page? What are they like in relationship to each other? What other significance might be those images have? Painters choose very specifically every single detail, every color, every type of flower. Nothing is left to chance. And so what do these kinds of ideas suggest to the viewer? The context is important. So when is this piece happening? What time of historical era are we in? What, as well, is the history of what's happened just before that? So are they reacting to something? The Romantic period is a reaction to the Classic period, for example, that sort of thing. And then also, what is the biography of the artist? What interests the artists have? Are they trying to make some kind of statement? Who's buying and selling this work of art? How did it come into being? And the last thing to think about when you're looking at a piece is really you. How do you come into the piece? What message does it seem to convey to you? How does it make you feel? And that's probably something that the artist may have intended. Moving on to the first slide, or the Gothic piece again, is the next slide. You'll see some questions there on the right side. What type of work is it? This is a painting. It's from 1930. Grant Wood was an American painter. 1930, in terms of context, we're looking at just the beginning of the Depression. He was traveling through Iowa, which is the history of this particular piece, and he saw one of these small color by numbers houses that were put up at the time for people in this rural part of Iowa to live in. He was overwhelmed by it, but also the way that it had this architectural detail at the top of the house of this Gothic window. Gothic is a form of architecture that wasn't necessarily a natural part of the Iowa landscape, particularly in the rural part. He thought it was kind of a silly thing to put on this house. So he went back and sketched the house, asked permission to be able to use it in his painting, and then he used his sister as the model for the woman in the painting, and then he used their dentist as the model for the man. There are a number of pieces of symbolism about it. This flowers over her shoulder, the fact that his pitchfork matches and mirrors the stitching on his overalls, the the fact that her apron is a 19th century apron, that she's wearing black, that she's looking off into the distance. So there's lots of different ways of reading this. You have the two figures very close to the front, the figure of the man and the woman. People assumed in the beginning that this was, people in the cities assumed that this was a satire of rural America, that it was making fun of the staid, sort of Bible-thumping perception of what rural people were like. That was perception of what people in the cities had about people in the rural parts of the country. Other people started to view this as a celebration of the spirit, of the pioneering spirit of America, of the hardworking, working class background of Americans. Other people thought that maybe this was a comment on the mourning traditions, M-O-U-R mourning, not M-O-R-N-I-N-G mourning. The idea that these people were not celebrating, but were participating in the Victorian tradition of wearing black with the curtains drawn, that she's in a mourning dress. The combination of his black jacket, very austere and somber, against the light of his shirt, the same is true of her dress and collar, and both of their sort of dark colors opposite in contrast with the white of the house, which is very interesting. So these are some ways of thinking about this painting. Moving on to Autumn Rhythm, which is by Jackson Pollock. This is a little bit later, almost 20 years later. And something that's interesting about this piece is this is painted by Pollock, who's one of the famous painters of our generation. In fact, actually, I should go back a second and talk a little bit more about American Gothic, forgive me. But American Gothic is one of the most parodied pieces, of all time, in that there's a version of The Simpsons from the television show doing this. It appears on Saturday Night Live, right? This sort of image of the two figures in front of the house has been parodied or made into satirical imitations for more than any other piece of American art. Anyway, going on to Pollock. So this is 1948. This is where he's using what's called a drip method, or a different kind of method. So this work, the last piece was about 3 feet by 2 feet. This piece is about 5.5 feet by almost 9 feet. So it's much more to be in the presence of this work. It's visually a little more engulfing to think about, which is something when you're considering. You're just looking at it right now on a PowerPoint presentation on a tiny slide, but if you're actually experiencing this work in person, it's a considerably bigger piece than what you're going to see on your screen. Pollock would say that there's no central point of focus about this work. Therefore, there's no hierarchy to it. This is abstraction, not trying to paint the likeness of something, which is different than maybe what we're used to. Pollock also changed the relationship of the painter to the canvas. So in this particular piece, he laid the canvas on the ground and was standing over it in order to paint it. So it wasn't set up vertically with an easel as he paints on it. He actually had it laying on the floor, and he's slopping and slapping, using wooden sticks and dripping paint in different ways. So he's really not interested in this traditional method of the way the painter's body is in relationship to the canvas. He's actually changing the entire relationship of painter to canvas. So there's no central point of focus. There's no hierarchy here. He's really interested in the spontaneity. There's this energy of creation, a process of coming into being in this piece. And so for him, it's more about that energy than it is about painting the likeness of something, to look like something. He says, I can control the flow of paint. There is no accident. So while it looks like he may have just slopped and slathered, he did do this. While there is spontaneity, there is some control here. He also said, this is a quote by Pollock, painting is a state of being. Painting is self-discovery. Every good artist paints what he is. So this, for Pollock, is Autumn Rhythm, is an experience of who he is, translated onto canvas, which is for him more interesting and more important for him to express than is the idea of painting something to look like something, to look in the likeness of something. The next slide is Boccioni, which is unique forms of continuity in space. This goes back in time to the teens. This piece is about, almost 4 feet tall. It is also bronze, I believe, yep. It's a futurist piece. This goes into the period called Futurism. He was interested in an idea that he calls synthetic continuity. So the piece is fluid, it's aerodynamic. I think it has a great muscularity and power to it. There's definitely movement in the piece. It's very graceful. The figure, the space, I would say the negative space. So there's the positive space of the sculpture itself, but then also the negative space between the two legs on two pedestals. That space between. And the other thing that's really difficult to experience with sculpture, obviously, is that you're looking at a two-dimensional image, which is much smaller than the actual image. And so in a gallery, you would have the experience, obviously, of walking around the three dimensions of the sculpture. So if you were really taking particular interest in the sculpture, I'd recommend going to do a Google search and at least being able to look at it from different angles so you can see what it looks like on different sides. His inspiration for this piece was a football player who was moving to catch a pass, a perfect pass, and so he was trying to capture that moment. Again, the energy or the idea of that moment less than the actual literal moment itself. I like this one a lot. I think it's fun. The next slide I wanted to show you is water lilies, the clouds. This is Monet. He's one of the more I guess, turned into posters and calendars painter that I can think of. This piece was worked on, I believe the dates are contributed there, 1914 to 1926. This is French and just before the beginning of the Great Depression in the United States. But this is 3 pieces that are put together, and they're part of a whole series of pieces by Monet that are called water lilies. But there are many, many water lilies, many pieces of it, of the whole series that he painted. And those pieces often get chopped up and turned into posters for dorm rooms and for calendars in your grandma's house. But one thing that I think is interesting is to note the original work is the scale of it. We're talking a little about scale and size. So if you go on to the next slide, you can see another in the series of water lilies. These again 3 pieces that have been put together. This one's reflections of clouds on the water lily pond. This is around 1920. This piece appears in MoMA in New York City. It is about 6.5 feet tall by 42 feet long. So it's in a. I will tell you, I've seen this piece live, and it's enormous. But to be able to sit on one of those benches that you can see in the photograph of the actual gallery space and to watch, to be able to look at the entire sort of piece, which is sometimes difficult if the gallery is very busy, but to be able to look at the whole piece, the sense of that, the way it sort of takes over your entire visual field, which is really interesting. We as a people are really connected to a lot of different screens. You're looking at me right now on a screen. We spend a lot of time narrowing our focus into these kinds of screens, and this is a whole different sort of expansive experience to sit in front of water lilies. So I wanted to make sure that I showed that to you as well, just to get a little sense of scale. Going back to some of those ideas we talked about earlier, or I mentioned earlier about color and shape, the colors here, this is Impressionism, so we're giving the impression or the idea of something, but not the actual physical likeness of it. So what is the impression of reflections of clouds on a water lily pond? What did that feel like? The soft pastel colors, the dabbling of light, the sort of slightly less shape, the shapeless forms on the water. We don't see literal clouds so much, but we see pieces of, and we have the sense of, right? Which is it's very powerful. Yeah. The last little piece on this introductory video you see from a couple different castings of it in different places, but this is Henry Moore's Large Two Forms. These are bronze castings, from 1969 when he finished the original one. This first one, I can't remember where this appears. I think the second one is from a garden in State University of New York, so if you're looking at either of the two of them, I wanted you to get a little bit of a different sense of what the two figures look like. Henry Moore was a British sculptor. The one, I think the second one again, is from SUNY Purchase. He really hopes that you'll experience his sculptures from a distance. He's created a lot of his career, towards the end of his career especially, was devoted to creating large outdoor sculptures for public works, so things that happen out in public. And so these pieces are meant to be approached from a distance and actually walk into and through. So he hopes that someone would actually walk between these two large pieces. You might walk through the center of them, so you're really experiencing the size of them. You can tell, I think, a little bit from looking at them, the scale. There's a little tiny bit of the first clip, or in the first slide, you can see the car that's parked, a couple cars that are parked behind, a little bit to the distance from the two. So you can get a size of the scale of these. And just the way the color of them as they start to weather in the outdoors is interesting. They're not rusting, but there's the way they sort of start to discolor the bronze. And what else do I want to say about these? Some people view these as possibly as erotic coupling, that it's a male and a female figure, that they're actually coming together in a sexual act. It may also just be in the way that they're relating to each other. I don't know if you saw that before or not, but that's not his idea either. That's something a critic who's talked about the pieces is speaking about them in that way. But either way, I think sort of the weight of them, there's definitely a heaviness, and yet there is movement and curve and shape in something that's so static. So just to go back and review, what is the medium of a piece? When you're looking at a piece, you can talk about its medium. So we've talked about brass, we've talked about oil painting, we've talked about bronze sculptures, we've talked a little bit about line, a little bit. I guess you could go back and look at a good example of the Continuity in Space piece, the way the lines are sharp and jagged, if they're fluid and circular, what are the shapes, what colors are included in the piece, is there a contrast between light and dark, which happens a good bit, the positive and negative space of a piece, and the scale, the size of it, and what that means to you as a viewer. How do those elements work together? Is there significance to the figures, the colors, the shapes? What is the time period, and who? A little bit about the artists themselves, and did the artists provide a statement about their work? And then, yeah, and the last piece again is what did the piece what did it try to convey to you? What sort of message is there? So as you're going to do your encounter with visual art sometime during this term, I hope that you're looking at pieces and thinking a little bit about them, considering those questions. You have a little bit of using that vocabulary as you're talking about art. I'm not a visual artist, and I don't know a lot about visual art, but that doesn't preclude me from experiencing it, and also from experiencing it with some educated thoughts and using some smart words about it, which can be grounded in my own experience of it. Which is the point. So as you go off, and if you choose to go to a gallery or to go into, let's say, a fine arts store and look at painting or look at pieces, you can start to think about some of these words. The more you look at art, too, the more you begin to be able to use the words in comparison to other things, because you see something and it makes you feel a certain way now that maybe makes you feel differently a different day, or makes you feel differently than a different piece made you feel. So you begin to have some points of comparison to talk about some of these works. I'm having some trouble creating the quiz for this particular lecture, so instead of a quiz, your deadline for this one, just to tell me that, to show that you've actually watched all the way to the end of the video, you should email me, let's see, well, here I'm sitting in Nashville, Tennessee at my friend's back patio, so you should email me to tell me that you've watched this video that was filmed in Nashville.